My name's Glenn Brown. I was born in England in 1966, in the north of England, in a small mining village. And my parents moved to a small village in Norfolk, which is in the south of England, when I was 5. It was a very rural area, not a lot of museums. So visual culture was quite thin on the ground in the area. But music and literature were much more important to my parents. So we grew up in a house full of books. And as a teenager, pop music, like lots of teenagers, was quite important to me. And it was at a time, I think, when punk had just finished or was just on the ebb, and pop music took itself quite seriously. It could be quite literate. A lot of the musicians had been to art college. I mean, bands like the Talking Heads or Happy Mondays or New Order. They came from quite an educated background. There were lots of references in their music to literature and to painting as well. For instance, it was interesting that my first introduction to Henri Fantin-Latour's paintings was by an album cover designed by Peter Saville for New Order. And it started a love of Fantin-Latour paintings for me. Joy Division, the references to literature, the references to Gogol and Dead Souls made me read the book, which introduced me to Russian literature, which my father had also introduced me to as well. I was brought up reading at an early age. But again, visual culture, painting, wasn't really part of what I'd been looking at. But it was interesting how European literature and arts and even film did come into my life at a very early age, sort of when I was 13, 14. In England, there was the BBC at 11 o'clock at night, switched to educational programs for what was called the Open University, which was a sort of adult learning university. And from 11 o'clock till 2 o'clock in the morning, they would show films, have lectures, and various programs for university students. So at the age of 13, 14, I was watching these programs on art or film or music for university students and just being utterly fascinated. The Open University was a huge part of my education. So by the time I started at art college, I'd already heard about a lot of art movements, or I'd read a lot of books that, relating to art and culture of the 19th, 20th century, but I hadn't really seen any of the paintings. I'd only seen them on these, poor quality television in the 1970s and early 80s. From a very early age, I drew continuously and painted. Like a lot of artists, I'm dyslexic. So other forms of education were slightly closed to me because in the 1970s and 80s, dyslexia didn't really exist. It was only when I was in my 20s that anybody told me properly that I had dyslexia. And that meant that going to art college was the much easiest way for me to go to university. I had 3 quite different forms of education. My previous education at Norwich had been very academic, a lot of life drawing. You were free to draw how you wanted. There was no particular rules, but life drawing and that idea of learning a sort of more academic way of understanding how to see and how to look was very important. which included composition, which I think was important. At Bath, the education was much more modernist, to do with colour theory and idea of theories of how your eye moved, much more to do with abstraction. And literature was very important in Bath also as well. And to a certain extent, French philosophy came in, but only if you wanted it. You had to pick that. And but at the time, the big influence was Charles Saatchi and the exhibitions he was putting on in his gallery in London. And also the Whitechapel Gallery was putting on, Nicholas Sirota was putting on exhibitions of German art, Gerhard Richter and other contemporary German artists of the time, and American art as well, American abstract sculpture, for instance. And that was a big influence. But I think the thing that, it was when I was still at Bath, Charles Saatchi put on an exhibition called New York Art Now, I think it was called, and that was in 2 parts. It was a very big exhibition, and it had Jeff Koons, Maya Vaisman, Cindy Sherman, Sherrie Levine, and it introduced me to appropriation art. And from that point, I kind of never looked back. I thought it opened my eyes to how you could make art that was very relevant to a fast-moving culture, a contemporary culture, and one that was used to looking at images. The use of photography and the images that surrounded people seemed to be pouring in magazines, television, film, and it seemed really important to me to make an art that was relevant to a public that was used to a massive amount of images coming in. It was partly called the picture generation, that for that very reason we were dealing with pictures, images of anything really, but it wasn't painting the real world, it was painting a mediated pictures world. In the 1980s, the term the death of painting was very prominent. I knew that something seemed to have broken within the history of painting, that it couldn't really go on. Film, installation, text-based works, performance, all seemed much more relevant, and I couldn't deny that they did appear more relevant and that painting did have a problematic future. But artists like Gerhard Richter had obviously decided that, well, let's deal with this idea of the death of painting directly, and Sigmar Polke, how can we talk about painting from an almost melancholic perspective, where the image starts to break down, disintegrate. And Polke and Richter were very influential to me, probably too influential for a long time, but they helped me find a way of sort of dealing with the mediated image and carry on painting more to the point. There was reason for me wanting to actually apply paint to canvas or panel or paper, whatever it was. I knew I liked that process, and I also knew I liked the history of painting. I liked that it had this wonderful, rich tradition, which is carried with you when you are an artist. You build upon that tradition, and you play with it, and you break it whenever you want to, and you ignore it whenever you want to, but it's always going to be there. And it's why I stuck with painting, even though I could see that it appeared to be dead in many ways. And obviously I'm very happy to say that I think the idea of the death of painting doesn't seem very relevant now. It seems very lively, and painting seems to be at a point now where it's in many ways it's the most relevant medium to a lot of artists and culture. So I'd started making these paintings based on Frank Auerbach and Karel Appel because they're both very thick gestural painters, and in a very ironic, direct way I realized that I was going to make these paintings of paintings, that I was going to in some sense make photorealist paintings of paintings. I like that idea of painting a flat surface. It came out of me making these paintings of the surface of the moon, because once again it's a flat surface that you're creating almost a trompe-l'oeil effect on the surface of the canvas. And once again my paintings were very much trompe-l'oeil, with Frank Auerbach, Karel Appel and Willem de Kooning as well. They were not so much a pastiche of those artists, but this understanding that it's almost lost in translation when they were paintings of a photograph of a painting, or rather they were paintings of a lithograph of a photograph of a painting. And that sense of translation, which very much came to me via Sherrie Levine's work, that idea, that wonderful distortion that happens when something is transformed from one idea to another, from one person to another, just completely caught me. And I loved Sherrie Levine's photographs, where she was taking photographs after artists, after photographers like Rodchenko or William Eggleston, really classic, famous photographs, rephotographing them. And then when you looked at her work, you kind of thought, well, what am I looking at here? Am I looking at Sherrie Levine? Am I looking at Rodchenko? Am I looking at the people that are photographed by William Eggleston? And you become dizzy because you don't know what to look at. And that sense of, I'm not sure, trying to get the audience to become dizzied by the sense of, I don't know what I'm looking at, remains quite strong in my work to this day. I want somebody to be looking at one of my paintings and be wondering, what am I actually meant to be concentrating on here? Is this a real brushstroke? Is it a fake brushstroke? Or is it somewhere in between? It's this strange, almost sci-fi sense of distortion. The science fiction paintings that I started to make obviously don't have anything to do with brushstrokes. So they were something of a change I had in my work, quite deliberately, because I didn't want to get stuck within this idea of just appropriating brushstrokes. It seemed that it could be something of a dead end. And so I was actually thinking about the idea of making photorealist paintings of photorealist paintings. For instance, Richard Estes was one of my favorite photorealist artists. He painted street scenes in New York, mostly. Very beautifully rendered, strange, never any people in them. But the idea of making a photorealist painting of a photorealist painting just seemed so mind-numbingly boring that I couldn't bear to do it. So I thought, how can I get around this? How can I make it more interesting for myself and the viewer, more importantly? And the idea came of making photorealist paintings of surrealist paintings. In many ways, a surrealist painting is like a photorealist painting, but it's painting the imagination, not reality. And from making a couple of paintings based on Salvador Dali's paintings, where I was distorting the original quite a lot. The first one I did, I painted the whole painting upside down. I started in one corner, worked my way across without any pre-drawing. So the image became distorted as I was copying it. And I was copying it in quite a lot of detail. The paint was applied very thinly and with tiny little brushes, which is something that I still do. And the surface was most importantly very flat on my paintings. You could see no apparent brushstrokes in my work. But after making a few paintings based on Dali, I wanted to push it even further, this idea of fantasy and escapism. So I started using artists like Chris Foss and Tony Roberts. Chris Foss especially was a fantastic science fiction illustrator. He was so inventive and playful with the work he was making. And his illustrations tended to be rather small. In fact, I encountered them on softback book covers, so the image often could be just this big at the bottom half of a book. And Chris Foss's originals, I think, weren't much bigger. But I wanted to expand these images, these fantastical images, up to a colossal art historical large painting scale, which involved me having to redraw and change the colour and add an awful lot of detail that wasn't actually there in the original. So it allowed me to make appropriation art, to refer to this idea of escapism and my apparent lack of escapism, referencing Sherrie Levine and that sort of gap between the original and the copy, but for me also to be quite inventive in the process of making the work. So it seemed to solve quite a few problems, those science fiction paintings. But I was still fascinated with the brushstroke. So I was, at the same time as making these paintings based on science fiction illustration, I was also making paintings based on Frank Auerbach. And the two almost started to become combined. I started to combine elements of the science fiction paintings into the Auerbach paintings. So I was painting these almost monstrous figures that were distorted, and I would change the backgrounds to make them appear to be in this sort of misty, ghost-like world, very much borrowed from science fiction landscapes. And sometimes there was even stars in the background, or planets, or reference to planets in the backgrounds of the paintings. And the colours often became intermingled, and I started becoming much more inventive. And I started playing around an awful lot more, distorting the original. But still, the idea of appropriation was very important to me. I wanted people to have that feeling of that loss of originality that I first found in Sherrie Levine. To a large extent, the way I paint something is much more important than what I paint. The subject matter is relevant. I mean, you do have particular cultural readings of a subject, but I'm really, like a lot of modernist artists, interested in the way something is painted. With Picasso, for instance, or Matisse, you don't really pay too much attention to the person who maybe he's painting, to the particular sitter. And to that end, both Matisse and Picasso and Modigliani actually take out the pupils very often. So you really feel like you can't have a communication with the sitter. Basically, they're saying, don't look at the person who's been painted, look at the artist, look at me, look at the way I've painted. And that's, I suppose, a tradition which I want to keep going, because I want people to look at me and I want them to understand what I'm trying to say rather than what the person depicted or what the landscape is that I'm painting or the bowl of fruit. I mean, to a large extent, a vase of flowers or a bowl of fruit is quite an abstract subject. Onto it you can apply lots of different ideas to do with life and death and religion, and sort of hope and beauty and ugliness, and the idea of nature and the idea of the way that the world is changing and we have to change our understanding of the natural world. You can apply all these ideas onto quite an abstract subject like a bowl of fruit. And that just seems wonderful because it allows you to be very inventive. And I have lots of ideas and I do want to communicate with people, and there is a real me in here. I'm just saying it's not the real me has to be mediated in order for me to be able to communicate with other people. So when I make an exhibition, I like the paintings to talk to each other, and this exhibition at Max Hetzler in Paris was made as a group of work over 2 years, and one painting was started and then another was started, and so by the end nothing was finished, but all the paintings were started and they were all talking to each other, they were all helping each other develop. And I would put 2 paintings next to each other, and what I learned from one I would apply to another, or what I learned what not to do on one painting I would then not do on the other. So the idea that the colour references in the work became sort of intermingled was quite evident. These paintings for the most part are very highly coloured. The different colours together, putting red next to green and orange next to purple, creates clashes, creates psychological changes in our brain, and I'm using that the volumes turned up quite a lot on the colour in these paintings. And for instance, in the 2 male nudes behind me, Indian yellow features quite prominently. Indian yellow being a colour made from ox's urine. They feed the ox mango leaves, take the urine, let the urine dry in the sun, and then crush it to make this very peculiar paint. It's a strange, slightly unpleasant yellow colour, slightly towards the green. You can't really paint a solid form with it because you can only glaze with it, because it doesn't cover anything really at all, but it glazes absolutely wonderfully. You apply this yellow over the top of a blue and it turns this very peculiar green. You put it over a purple and it turns into this strange bluey grey colour. And you just learn that one colour applied over another creates a third colour that's impossible to get by any other means. And glazing is all over these paintings, that idea that light travelling through one layer of paint, bouncing out again, and changing your perception of what you're looking at is very important to the way I paint. There's one painting in the exhibition called The Untitled, and it has no colour, it's black and white. Or rather, it's not quite black and white, because I realised that again, when you glaze white over black, it goes quite a cool grey colour, and when you paint black over white, you get quite a warm colour appearing. So even though I just used 2 tubes of paint to paint it, there are actually quite a lot of differences within the black and white. So even in a painting that appears to be monochromatic, there are colour changes in it. The Untitled is based on an Albrecht Dürer drawing. And it's actually a rather interesting drawing because originally Dürer drew 2 figures on a sheet of paper, and at some point some art dealer decided they could make more money if they cut the work in half and sold them separately. So they now completely separated these 2 parts. And the painting The Hoi Polloi, also in the exhibition, is the matching part to this painting, The Untitled. So we have one is an angel and one is Christ. Now in The Untitled, I've manipulated what was originally a painting of Christ, so the sex of the figure becomes much more ambiguous. In my mind, it's both Christ and Mary at the same time, because some people look at it and think it's a man, definitely. Some people think of it and it's definitely a woman. And that's exactly the point at which I want the painting to be. I wanted it to depict a rather classical idea of the sorrowful Mary, but also fairly obviously in certain elements it becomes Christ-like, it becomes more masculine. So it's a painting very much playing with religious sentiment and playing with sort of sexual identity, I suppose, as well. It has this rather peculiar rectangle in the bottom of the painting, which was there to start with. It's both a device to move the viewer's eye down to the bottom continuously, which is almost asking the viewer to lower their vision, to look down, to feel sorrowful, to feel melancholic as you look down, and then you move back, your eye moves back up to the person depicted. You're continually grounded when looking at the work. But also it's this almost like a speech bubble at the bottom, a cartoon-like speech bubble at the bottom of the painting, that you can apply your own title to the work in your imagination, I hope, rather than reality. But you can apply what you want the work to be called in the bottom. Hence why I called the work The Untitled. It's not as if it has no title, it has an invitation to the viewer to title it, to subject Christ or Mary to whatever accusations you want to put upon them. It's a painting that took a very long time to make. It was over 2 years in the making. It has a lot of very fine detail in it, as do all of my paintings. The idea of detail and the idea of trying to get the viewer to get closer, to look at all the small marks and extraneous little lines that appear, hopefully gets the viewer to be animated when they're looking at the work. They see the work from a distance and they come close in to look at it, and then they walk back again to look at the work from a distance. And that's how I want somebody to be walking around this exhibition at Max Hetzler. I want them to be spending as much time as possible here, looking at the work from a distance and then seeing things that they hadn't seen before. There are often lots of hidden faces in the paintings, even in a figure painting like the ones behind me. If you look closer, you will see little heads and faces and eye sockets and mouths and other orifices within the flesh of the figures. And that surrealist sense of playing around with the human form is in all of the paintings here. Marcel Duchamp's an artist that I do continually refer to, whether it's a masterpiece like Nude Descending a Staircase that I think changed contemporary art hugely, or appropriation works he made, like the getting a postcard of the Mona Lisa, putting a moustache on it and writing LHOOQ underneath, which again is a very direct link to the painting The Untitled, where I put a blank box underneath for you to write whichever letters, whether you think the Mona Lisa has a hot ass or not, or whether you think the Mona Lisa is actually a man or not, is very similar to the painting The Untitled. But his idea of appropriation is sort of inherent in an awful lot of my works, and and humour as well. I think Duchamp was a humorist. He was a joker all the way through his life, a very deadpan joker, and I think sometimes people don't get him being funny. I mean, the urinal is fundamentally meant to be a joke, although people take it extraordinarily seriously. I want people with my work, often the reaction I want more than anything else is for them to laugh at them, because along with laughing comes a whole host of other emotions. And when you laugh at something because you think it's absurd, that's the reaction that I'm trying more often than not to get. The titles that I very often give are really there to make the viewer find the work humorous in a very particular way. For instance, one of the paintings behind me is called Dirty Little Seahorses, and it's a painting of a male nude. And you think, well, what have seahorses got to do with this male nude, and why is the seahorse dirty? And then you get into sort of sexuality and sort of, well, is it sexually sort of, you know, and then I sort of my understanding of seahorses is that they're rather innocent, bizarre little animals, and the idea that one could be a bit frisky, a bit erotic, just seemed very funny. They're actually, they can change sex, seahorses, which is rather interesting. But I like the idea that the title of a work is like Marcel Duchamp said, it's like adding an invisible colour to a painting, that by titling a work that you can put a way of seeing it that was otherwise unavailable to you. There's no colour which you can add there's no colour that I can add to that painting which will have the same meaning as dirty little seahorses, or the other male nude is called When the Satellite Sings, and satellites don't sing, and why is this figure thinking about satellites floating around the earth and singing? And it creates a sense of confusion which is both funny and tragic, and does have quite a specific meaning. There is something to be had, I think. It is meant to be poetical. They're not just meant to be absurd. It's not as if they're without meaning, even though that meaning can be, as I said, poetically quite complex.